Coinbase
Yeah.
is an interesting one. It's there's kind of like a weird paradox that goes on for me with them because they've received heavy criticism in the past for their, certainly from the Bitcoin community, for their focus on
Yeah.
other chains and crypto and less of a dedication to Bitcoin, which I think some of it's fair. But at the same time, like, I'm really aware how much Coinbase has done behind the scenes to hold off the freight train of regulation and bad regulation, which I think not everyone is aware about, but I'm aware they've done a lot in the background to just keep that freight train from running over this industry. What is it can you say what you do for them?
Yeah, sure. I work for strategies. I used to be head of strategy for NYMEX. So I'm not head of strategy for Coinbase Institutional, but that's the function I serve in is strategy. We don't really have a head of strategy, but I work for Brett and Greg, head of Institutional, and I help them think through the same problems I help NYMEX think through, like where should we be in the world? How do we get more institutional investors to get on chain? And just help build the institutional business.
So in doing that, having come from a traditional TradFi world and coming into this, and I'm really stealing Danny's question, but you're coming, I'm stealing it from you.
No, that's all right. Well, the big question I had is like, how immature did this seem when you like came into it as a space?
Yeah, so I didn't, a lot of folks in, can I keep saying in crypto or in Bitcoin? What do you want me to say here?
I mean, if you're describing them,
yeah. So a lot of folks in crypto will say we're in the first inning. Oh, we're so early. I actually don't like that. I'll be honest, because it's the technology is 10 to 15 years old. So I think you have to acknowledge we're not in the first inning.
Yeah.
I don't even like the analogy. I don't know what inning we're in. I mean, so there's still people are still educating on commodity derivatives, which is a 30-year-old thing. Yeah. So I don't find that discussion useful. Just from a numbers perspective, like there is a smaller percentage of institutional investors who engage in this asset class than other idiosyncratic asset classes like derivatives, like swaptions, like all that stuff. So I think we are under engaged. I think of it that way. Now that could be good and bad, right? It's good if we're under engaged because either the asset class is not ready and will come ready, or institutions aren't aware of the asset class. Problem that crypto has is it's eaten up a lot of airspace. My mother knows what crypto is, and my mother still can't change the time on her microwave. And that is good and bad. The bad part of that, the good part of that obviously is people know about it. That's great. The bad part is people know. And so if they've decided to not engage at this point, it becomes a harder sell because they've already made up their minds about the asset class. So I think for institutions, this notion that they're naturally going to engage, that's not true. We have to work at it. Like there are a lot of institutions that don't trade commodity derivatives. I remember my early days at NYMEX, we launched a jet fuel contract. And we were talking to the airlines. And we were like, hey, we have this amazing thing that you can hedge your jet fuel exposure. And they were like, you talk to these CFOs, we're not dumb people. And they'd be like, we're not in the business of speculating on commodities. I'm like, well, dude, if you're short jet fuel, you have to buy it. If you don't hedge, you're speculating. That's the whole fucking point. And it was very, very frustrating. And eventually they came on, but it took a long time. And there's a lot of firms that like use natural gas to bake, their ovens, like companies that make muffins. And they don't hedge. And it's insane. They just don't do it. But because they just view that as another thing, this complex, crazy derivative space. So I don't think the early inning narrative is helpful. I don't think everyone who doesn't do it is a Luddite and doesn't get it narrative is helpful. Maybe that was the case 5-10 years ago. They're not dumb. When we speak about regulators, when we speak about folks who've chosen to not engage in the sector, if we just say, oh, they're all dumb, they just don't get it, they don't see the future, it's self-defeating. It didn't work. It didn't work when we tried to sell derivatives on people, and it's not going to work when we try to sell digital assets, engagement in digital assets. So I will say that what made me optimistic enough to want to work with a firm like Coinbase in the institutional section is I think that appetite is there. I do think it's the former. I think it's they're waiting. The ones who are not, some will just never engage, and we have to be okay with that. Just like some never trade derivatives. But there's a pretty big chunk of institutional activity, especially hedge funds that just seek out alpha, that they're just waiting for this asset class to have all the bells and whistles they need to trade it in a regulated manner because they themselves are regulated. No different from commodities.
So they're waiting on regulation or new tools that we don't have yet.
They're waiting on some degree of regulation. They're okay with opaque regulatory. If the other stuff is there, they're okay. I mean, there are things like there's like this wacky thing in fixed income called season and sell, which is if you in the credit market and you have offshore investors and you buy something in the U.S. that produces what's called ECI, effectively connected, like rent. You buy an apartment building that pays rent into it. That's taxable U.S. income. But you have offshore investors. They don't want to pay taxes. So what you do is you buy it and then you let it sit for 30 days or 60 days or like 90 days. And then you sell it to the offshore fund. And magically it all goes away. And if you talk to half of the attorneys you talk to go, that's bullshit. Other half go, yeah, it works. There's no, it's a relatively opaque area. There's no law. It's like there's no thing they can point to that says this is okay. Tomorrow the IRS could turn around and say, yeah, that's of course that's bullshit.
Yeah.
But everybody does it. So again, this notion that you have to have regulatory clarity, certainty is not true. You have to have more than what we have in crypto for sure. And you can't have an adversarial regulator, which is unfortunately what we have right now. But you can have some opaqueness. But if you have the opaqueness, you have to have the institutional infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You have to have the market makers. You have to have the credibility, the clear counterparties, right? I'm not going to take regulatory risk and idiosyncratic market risk. I'll take one or the other, but not both.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the alpha has to be there. Like alpha solves everything. Just returns solve everything. If you can make 500%, I'll get comfortable with the risk in some small way.
So in that case, then, what's happening now with like the Operation Choke Point and them closing down like banking for this? That must be a huge burden
for the U.S. Yeah. I think. Look, I've always been in weird asset classes, so I'm used to regulatory arbitrage. Right. Back in the day when I was at NYMEX, they had this thing called the NYMEX ICE Henry Hub ARB, which is because of idiosyncrasies in the way the U.S. regulator and the U.K. regulator regulated natural gas options. There was this ARB that exists. You could buy New York, sell London, because they were fungible to each other, or vice versa. And you could lever that up, and you could lock in at points like a 16% risk-free. Mm-hmm. Your risk was just to the relative exchanges, which were AAA. And that thing hung around for like a decade. Like ARBs is supposed to go away. It just because it was based on, back then it mattered like the time of day. And it was based, so there's always, in complex asset classes, there are always regulatory nuances. Mm-hmm. I have never seen as wide of a spread as I see now between the rest of the world and the US. And what's really interesting is because the US is still the bellwether market. It is still the world's premier respected regulatory and most liquid capital market. And my concern would be because the US is so incredibly negative that it would taint the rest of the world. They would say, oh, we got to wait to the SEC. They're not. They were for a little bit, but now they've made a decision that they think the US is wrong. And they think that the US will eventually come to reasonability, which I also think so. And they think they're getting a year to 18-month head start. And they're off to the races.
So that means, therefore, you, as a business, your strategy is to make sure you corner those international markets.
Yeah, Coinbase has been public about, especially recently, about it's not leaving the US by any means. But I think remember, NYMEX lasted for 80 years before it had to go overseas. I think digital assets will have to move faster to build a pole position in those markets. So look, I think if the US was a fabulous regulatory environment, I would still be urging Coinbase to set up overseas. Every major exchange in the world, NYSE, Euronext, Deutsche Börse, CME, they all have exchanges in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. They have them in London. These are fungibly global instruments. You have to be. If you're an exchange and you want to trade a global instrument, you have to be overseas. Certainly, there's an increased urgency to accelerate that because of the way the U.S. is approaching it. But I'm optimistic. I do think the U.S. I think we're wrong. I mean, maybe we're right and the rest of the world is wrong. Maybe. I don't think so. So I think eventually that'll become apparent. And the U.S. doesn't lose. We don't like to lose. So eventually we'll figure out how to save face and do maybe not a full about. I don't think we'll ever be as, say, enthusiastic as the UAE. But I do think that it'll revert to the mean because I think we'll see the widening gap and we'll see the rest of the world saying, sorry, we love you guys, but we're all in.
Yeah.
And we will not give up that tax revenue. We will not give up that positioning. And so I do think we'll come back to reasonability.
Yeah, I'm finding the expansion in or the adoption in South America quite interesting. Obviously, we have a very, I know it's Central America, but we have a very good case study in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. We have various stories about politicians from Brazil, Argentina,
Colombia. It's very popular in Colombia.
It's very popular. And so I can see I think I can see why it's happening. I mean, the US has a goal of defending its position as the global reserve currency, and everyone else has a need to get away from
That's right.
the US because they suffer from, when there's massive inflation in the US, it compounds the issues for other countries who are buying their resources in the dollar. So
Yeah.
there's a natural need to try and get away from that position. So I think it's only natural. I think you're right. I think the US is wrong on this. I think the UK similarly is wrong on this, and
But
we will come
they're
back.
coming around. UK made a big U-turn last 6 to 8 months. I mean, the new administration there, the Rishi administration, is night and day different from the previous
Of
administration.
course.
There's no question. I mean, their FCA is still lukewarm to positive, but way better than it was. Way better than it was 6 to 8 months ago. The UK, in my mind, is doing what I think America will eventually do. They're returning. They're abandoning a untenable position for a thoughtful position. We could all maybe want it to be a little more thoughtful, but I love that. I love that growth path over a relatively short period of time, and I hope the US follows suit.
Yeah, and another concern on the US side is it seems to be non-partisan.
Yeah,
Or there's some bipartisan support for certain bills. Which,
I don't know how we got here.
Yeah,
Like,
they
it's so weird.
Let's literally fight on everything apart from this.
I mean, we have politicians who think that an anti-crypto stance is a winning political strategy.
I know.
I mean, we have to take some blame for that as a community. Like, for it to get to that point, we have to be introspective and say, how did we get to a point where? Because these aren't stupid people, right? They have polling, they have we can say they're all dumb. They're not. Like, I still stand by. Like, I don't like what the SEC is doing, but the people at the SEC, I know the rank and file staff. They're not dumb. They're not. They're smart, thoughtful people who are doing what they think is best. Maybe I'll get flamed for this, but I do think so.
You will.
But I know some of them,
yeah.
and I know them, and
it depends who it is.
you know,
I mean,
no, there's others who are.
If it's Hester Peirce, I'm with you. If it's Gary Gensler, I'm not.
I'm not going to say names, but like I may be hopefully optimistic that there is thoughtfulness there, because I know some of the people who still work there, and I have presented to them over the years, and I know they're thoughtful because I've had drinks with them afterwards, and I know they're not closed-minded, and I know they're not dumb. But it's the zeitgeist, unfortunately, has just shifted from the top down. But yeah, I think that I agree. It's unfortunate, but I am hopeless. I am a hopeless optimist about our country, and I do think we eventually. That's the Brits say that about. Eventually, Americans do the right thing, right? World War II. That's what. Eventually we come around and do the right thing. So, yeah. I mean, I hope so.
Oh.
But if only for self-interest, because this is growing. This is growing in the rest of the world, and the narrative right now. So back to this like political campaign about anti-crypto. They went and they did polling, and the polling came back and said this is a good way to win hearts and minds. So how the hell did we get there? How did a technology and/or asset class like derivatives never got to this point? And by the way, I remember early NYMEX days. There was a conscious discussion. Why do we need this stuff? Why do we need crude oil derivatives? What the hell is this? This is all paper. This is nonsense. The same bullshit we're hearing about digital assets. I heard about derivatives. They went to we don't just kill this whole thing. We don't need any of this stuff. Like, that was a real conversation 20 years ago.